It's the Church of Jesus Christ. Stephen, do you think the deeply Christian heritage of America is largely forgotten about today?
I absolutely believe it's forgotten about, and I think there's a reason. You know, Karl Marx said that a people without a heritage are easily persuaded. And so I think there's been a systematic attempt to drive the Christian heritage of this country away so that other ideologies could come in. And so I think we've got to reclaim that heritage and proclaim it as loudly as we possibly can.
When you do think about the founding of America, so much of it is improbable. To think about all of the stories that went into the founding and the Great American Experiment almost 250 years ago. Talk to our audience a little bit about the improbability of America's founding.
I love that you're using that word improbable, because I've thought about writing a textbook on American history, and that's what I would call it, the improbable nation. You know, I had a historian tell me once that the fact that the colonies won the American Revolution, compared to, of course, the British Empire, was like the New York Police Department defeating the U.S. Army. That's how improbable it was. That's the ratio, of course, that shouldn't have worked in our favor. Time and time again throughout American history, improbable things are happening. The minority wins. The United States prevails when it shouldn't. And I think it is because of God. I think it is because of providence. And I think we need to reclaim that story.
Yeah, so let's talk about providence. When we talk about the hand of providence, when we talk about the providential hand of God being upon America, how does that make the American story so unique?
You know, I think the American story is unique because God is a covenant-making God. And when I study American history, I constantly find the Pilgrims, the Puritans, the early colonists, they're constantly making covenant with God. You know, Leopold von Ranke, one of the great historians, said that about 90% of the American colonists were Calvinists. Well, that means they understood covenant. They were coming from that Scottish Reformation history. They knew what covenant was. And they were constantly making covenant with God, constantly proclaiming days of prayer and fasting, constantly asking God to fashion a nation. And I think He's been faithful to us for that reason. And so we do have a unique history, and it really is a providential history in the truest sense.
America is not a perfect nation, never was. But when you look at our 250-year history, God has provided in profound ways for our nation. What are some of those ways that we have just seen an abundance of provision in the history of this nation?
Well, I mean, I would use the word miracles, the miracles that have happened throughout this history. Just for example, let's take the Thanksgiving story just briefly. 66 days in a ship no larger than a volleyball court, 103 people sail across the North Atlantic in water so cold that you would die if you were in it for just 3 minutes if you were floating around in it. And yet they were preserved time and again. At one occasion, a guy fell off the ship. The ship then veered back towards the guy and the waves picked him up and shot him back through the hatch into the deck below. I mean, it's like God's playing basketball with this guy to preserve his life. I could go on and on, the revivals, the renewals. One of the things that moves me is when I study the American Revolution and I compare the major battles the colonists won with days of prayer and fasting in the nearby region. So a town's praying and fasting, but over the hill is a battle that the colonists win when really by rights they should not have. So the Lord has been faithful to America, and we've got to return the favor.
Thinking about the word miracle, there's a movie coming out this June based on Michael Medved's book, The American Miracle. Let's take a sneak preview.
I came to persuade you to avoid these dangers.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
For the last 50 or 60 years, we haven't been telling the story of our nation. And this film, The American Miracle movie, is a providential film of God acting in history in our past, which we haven't heard.
It's not that we're telling an untold story. We're telling a forgotten story. Every aspect and element of that period of time when these founding fathers were fighting for our nation's independence and liberty, there is an indelible, unmistakable connection to Christianity throughout that period.
I have lived such a long time. And the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth. that God governs in the affairs of men.
We go through the true history of America with some of the best scholars, the best actors, and we tell the true history of America. We just really want to encourage everybody, go check this out. You think you know history? I didn't know all this history. This is amazing, the true story of American history.
This isn't a fantasy. This really happened. And that's the reason why we have Robbie George and these other scholars in the movie.
We're deeply fallen, sinful creatures, and yet made in the very image and likeness of God, that is, possessing dignity and therefore rights.
And we also have Richard Dreyfuss playing Richard Dreyfuss.
America is something that I hold in my heart.
Americans of today should regain our bearings that our nation is no accident.
Stephen, miracle does seem like a strong word, but doesn't it apply to the American story?
Oh, there's just no question. Time after time after time, supernatural events, sovereign works of God. Let me give you a quick example. In 1849, we were having a cholera epidemic in American history. Well, thousands and thousands had been killed. And our president, Zachary Taylor, declared prayer and fasting throughout the nation. Within a matter of weeks, that cholera epidemic lifted. I could cite time and again when renewals of religion, outpourings, and great surges of the gospel, miraculous things have happened. So another way to frame American history is to talk about our miraculous history, our miraculous American story. It just would not have happened without providence. Our founding fathers were genius people, but they could never have created a nation this successful apart from the grace of God.
Here at Coral Ridge Ministries, we're working on a special program called the Sons of Liberty, which captures the blossoming of independence in the city of Boston. We're going to be highlighting historical figures like John Hancock, Samuel Adams, Paul Revere. Speak to them not only as historical figures in early American history, but also how their Christianity shaped their understanding of the great American experiment.
You know, Rob, it's really hard to exaggerate the influence of Christianity in that era. Remember that we had just had the Great Awakening led largely by George Whitefield, and historians tell us that every single home was impacted by the gospel and by that renewal. So these men weren't just lightly Christian. They weren't just, as we sometimes say, Sunday morning Christians. These men were passionately Christian. And what's important is that their vision of liberty grew organically from the gospel. Some historians have called the American Revolution a holy war because it was a battle against a cold state church and then, of course, the fiery Christianity of the colonies. So these men are not just our founding fathers politically, but they were exemplars of the gospel and exemplars of a theology of liberty and freedom that we should revere to this day.
As we approach the 250th anniversary of America in 2026, why is it so important that our Christian heritage is emphasized and included in all of the celebrations that will happen here in our country?
You know, the past is not just the past, it's also prologue. When we drive our cars, we don't only look through the front windshield, we look at mirrors that show us what's behind us, because that helps us align ourselves. We need to be aligned in our generation, which means we have to remember who we were. In the words of the Lion King, we have to remember who we are. And so I think we have to reclaim that faith, because our nation is adrift right now. Our nation is wrestling with itself, wrestling with its definition of itself. And so those of us who understand that providential history have got to bring it to bear on this generation so we can align ourselves and get on with our great national destiny.
Thank you, Stephen.
You bet.